Hi everyone. So my name's Sarah. I am the same person as in the photo while it's shared. I have just dyed my hair, and I know it tends to throw people a little bit. So I've been a consultant as a data visualization consultant for like 6 years now. I started out in a small startup company and now work for Version 1, which is why there's so much Version 1 branding. So Version 1 are a software consultancy. We specialise in digital data and design. I work in the data department with a team of other data visualization consultants. To begin with, I do like stats, and you will find throughout the presentation there's a lot of stats in there. Obviously, I work in data. I like facts. I find them relaxing, and I like to back up what I say. So before this presentation, I did quite a lot of research. I'm actually quite new into the accessibility side of design. So I recently started working in the Power Platform space, building apps. And when you build apps, you cannot pass them out. You can't put them into production. Reports and how much we do actually think about accessibility in reports, and how much of user adoption is probably limited by us not really realizing that we just haven't designed them to be fully accessible. So it sent me on this sort of journey where I've started to look into it and understand a little bit more about it for myself, and so that I can share that information with other people who are also designing reports. So the first stat which really shocked me was that in the UK, 16.1 million people have a disability, which is 24% of the entire population. That is 1 in 4 people. I didn't really expect it to be so high. I don't think we do really design so much for disability, and especially when we're designing reports, I have rarely heard accessibility talked about. And there's obviously a lot of different types of disability, and that's why I think it's really important that we do start that conversation. So, oh, bloody hell. I think I'm going to have to do 2 at once. There we go. So the social model of disability. This was actually started by a group of disabled people, and their theory in the social model of disability is that we as a society disable people. It's not their impairments that disable them, it is the barriers that we have created as a society. So this is also known as the barriers approach. So the barriers can be physical, they can be as simple as not providing ramp access, not providing a disabled toilet. They can be caused by people's attitudes to differences, but they can also be caused by what is called the information and communication barriers. So this occurs when content is not accessible. So this is the one that I'm going to be talking about today, and how we can make our content more accessible. So if you've ever worked in sort of web design, you will have heard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is what most web content is measured by, and it's sort of like the gold standard. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines help make web content accessible to people with disabilities. So there's 4 key principles of the guidelines. Number 1 is perceivable. That is that information and user interface components must be presentable in ways that they can perceive. Operable. User interfaces, components and navigation must be operable. Understandable. Information and the operation of user interface must be understandable. And finally, robust. Content that can be interpreted by a wide range of user agents, including assistive technologies. So where does this fit in with dashboard design? With Power BI dashboards, we should be aiming for usability by as many people as possible. You can design compelling dashboards that are beautiful while also including for accessibility. So whenever we build reports, no matter who our audience, we should be aiming for usability for as many people as possible. And you also have to consider, and I think as a consultant, this is one I've had quite a lot when I have raised accessibility concerns with clients, you don't necessarily know who of your users might have a disability, who might have extra requirements. They themselves might not know. So you have to compensate that already and build it into that design to begin with, so that the design doesn't have to be adjusted afterwards. So what I'm going to talk about is designing for a diverse audience. I'm not going to go through every single disability or every single impairment out there, because we would be here all night, but I have cherry-picked a few to talk about. So I'm going to look at designing for people with colour vision deficiency, which is also known as colour blindness, designing for users with low literacy, not technically a disability, but very important, designing for neurodiversity, designing for low vision and the use of screen readers, and lastly, designing for people with mobility impairments. So, to begin with, designing for users with colour vision deficiency. So this was probably the first one that I was ever aware of when I got into dashboard design. And that's because I worked at a very small startup, I worked with a lot of men, and 3 of the people that I worked with out of 12 were colourblind, and I was just shocked. We work obviously naturally with a lot of colour when we work in design, and I thought, wow, that's, I just didn't expect I'd met someone who was colourblind before, but I really started to learn a lot about colour blindness and how someone with colour blindness perceives the world. So statistically, 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women are affected by colour blindness. Again, that is another shocking statistic. About 300 million people worldwide have colour vision deficiency, so that's almost equal to the entire population of the USA. In the UK, people with colour vision deficiency represent about 4.5% of the population. So it is something that you do need to consider when you are designing dashboards. So there's different types of colour deficiency, and that affects the perception of different colours. So the most common type is red-green. I think people a lot of the time assume that means you just can't see the colours red or green, but actually it's any colour that has red or green in it. So you equally would struggle with orange, with yellow, with blue. It is the most common type, and if you have a moderate red-green colour blindness, you can actually only identify around about 5 colours from a box of 24 pencils. So if you imagine how different a dashboard that typically has reg statuses, because a lot of companies like to use red, amber, green, someone with that kind of deficiency wouldn't be able to see it. So I've included what it kind of looks like for someone who has colour blindness with the different types. So within these charts, you can see within the centre what normal colour vision looks like, so standard colour vision. And you can see with the first 2, which is red-green colour blindness, if you look at the colours green and the colours red, and even the colours yellow, someone with that type of colour blindness just sort of sees that murky brown. So when people are using reg statuses, and even think of traffic lights, it's everywhere, those people can't really distinguish between those colours. And then there's also blue-yellow colour blindness. So it's, again, completely different, but it shows that those people mostly see blues and pinks, where we see oranges and greens. There's also complete colour blindness, and this is less common, but naturally that means you can't see any colour, so you do see everything in black and white. Now, when it comes to designing for users with colour vision deficiency is a mouthful. The first don't is don't only use colour as the only means of relaying information. So again, with the example of rags, and I really go back to this a lot because as a consultant, I work with a lot of clients that really want the rag status. It's what they know, but they just can't let it go. So don't use it as the only means of conveying information on the page. By all means, use colour to attract users to certain points on the page, but don't make that the only thing. Avoid colour combinations that would be difficult to someone with colour vision deficiency to tell apart. So I've said red-green, but there are many different colour combinations. Do educate yourself on which ones those are and try to avoid them. But also consider that if you contrast by colour but you maintain the same brightness, then elements of someone with colour vision deficiency can just look blended. So you also want to consider your hues in there as well. Generally, when creating a colour palette personally, I don't like to use a lot of colour. I like to use 1 or 2 colours, and I like to use shades of colours, because someone who is colourblind can understand the different shades of colours. Also, it just looks better. So do use colour to highlight what is already visible. Contrast with brightness and tone rather than pigmentation, and do use a combination of colour shapes and text. So if you're designing something like a KPI, for example, and the person you design for does really want that red, amber, green status, they want to know that, when the sales are good, it's green, when they're bad, it's red. What you can do is just add an icon, just add an arrow with an up and a down. Immediately that's accessible. It's also just looks better, and it's a little bit easy to read as design. You can use marker shapes. So within Power BI, you have the option to turn marker shapes on. If you think about things like a line chart, you could turn the marker shapes on and set different marker shapes for different lines, so that that's not the only way that you can understand it. You could use different line widths or different dash strokes within a line chart, for example, or you can use direct labels as well. So it's really using that combination of information so that it's just not limited to colour. Also, I would say do use a colourblind friendly and accessible colours, but test your colours, because if you can see all the colours, you don't know what someone can't see. And for someone who is colour blind, they just don't necessarily know what they can't see. They can't tell you that that doesn't look the colour that you think it looks, because it doesn't look like that, and that's all they know. Quite funnily, perhaps not funny, but my father-in-law is colour blind. And my mother-in-law said that when she met him for about a year, he wore this really bright purple tracksuit. And she just thought it was like really in contrast to his personality and didn't understand. After about a year of dating, she felt comfortable enough to say, you know, what's the crack with the purple tracksuit? And he's like, what? I don't have a purple tracksuit, it's blue. He just doesn't see it that way. So you can't rely on the users to tell you that that's not the right colour. So there's 2 tools that I recommend, but there's actually quite a few tools out there. Hopefully these are going to load. So one is Colour Adobe. If you've never used Colour Adobe before, honestly, someone introduced this to me about the first year that I really got into tech, and it's like my favourite tool. Even if I'm redecorating the house, it's just like really good. So Colour Adobe is by Adobe. It's free. Anyone can use it. It will create you cohesive colour palettes. You can, which is one of my favourite things, upload an image and create a colour palette from that. So I'm a consultant, I work a lot with clients. They don't always have branding guidelines, but what you can do is take like a logo from a website, upload it, and it will create you a colour palette. So if we select a file.
Are you sharing that screen?
Oh God, no.
Sorry. So you're gonna have to. This could be fun. Okay. Okay.
That's not it. That's definitely not the one.
Right.
You got to drag this one.
That one.
Yeah. Exit.
Sorry.
Da-da-da.
Okay. There you go. Come on.
Okay, back to Colour Adobe.
I'll
Oh,
stay
but
down.
now I'm having to like use the mouse over here. Okay, bear with me, it's a little bit clunky. So if you select a file, and this is just loads of random files on my computer. Some of my dog, some of the logos. This is an image I created on Copilot for about 4 months. Oh, that's not the nicest colour palette to go with, but you can see it will immediately extract colours from the image and create you a colour palette. And you can have a play around as well on the left-hand side. It has different vibes that you can use. If you want to go muted, you want to go for deeper tones. I'm quite liking the bright one, although I'm not seeing them change. It will give you all the codes for the colours that you're using as well. So then you can put them into your Power BI theme. And then you can then test how accessible they are. So it has this tab here, accessibility tools. There's 2 tools within here that you can use. The first is contrast checker. And we'll talk about contrast more as we go on, but it lets you text the contrast between what you would use as your text colour and your background colour. And then it will give you the score and suggest ones that you could use to make it better. So you can see on the right-hand side, it's saying these ones will give a better contrast ratio. And then you can also see if it's colourblind safe. So you can see here, this is saying no conflicts found, swatches are colourblind safe. But you know, if you sort of like move these to some of the, this is really hard to do with from this angle. Let's pull them into. Yeah, you start to go for like a rag status and you scroll down, you'll see that someone with colour blindness will see it like this. So they're just going to see all these like dirty shades of yellow. They're not going to see the reds and the greens in there. And I'm not going to try and butcher pronouncing this, but someone who is red-yellow colourblind will see something completely different. So it's definitely worth using. Again, like I said, I just use it all the time for creating colour palettes, but it's also good for testing. The other tool is, see if this loads, colour blindness simulator. So you can get some extensions, which means when you upload to Power BI Service, you can actually just like use the plugin on your extension and it will load on your reports. I just prefer this one personally because it's just a little bit nicer to use. But for this one, you just upload an image. So what you can do is once you've created a report, you could just take an image of that report, upload it and check what it will look like. Some have colour blindness and you can check different types. Don't ask me if there's pictures of Swedes on there. So choose file. Right. I got this on the internet before, so apologies if this is your dashboard. Right. So this is a common one. I always get requested this. I think they're just trying to make this up, but red, amber, green status, and then you can then play around and see what that's going to look like with different colour blindness applied. And you've got like loads of different tools on there. There we go. Green, blind, immediately. Well, it just doesn't make sense to anyone. So again, if someone's really like, yes, we need those colours, you can play around with the hues. So you could go with like a really dark green and a bright red, and then someone would see the contrast. Generally, it looks like Christmas, and I don't recommend it. I've never found a colour palette that looks nice. I would go back to saying, you know, make them aware, and if you really can't steer them away, start using labels and shapes and things like that to draw out the differences. Right, let's work out to get off this now. Okay. So, designing for users with low literacy. I recently learned from attending a conference that one of my colleagues held about designing for low literacy in the web, that 1 in 6 adults in England are estimated to have very low literacy levels. So that's defined by the UK National Literacy Trust. And what that means is that in the UK, the average reading age for adults is actually between 9 and 11 years old. Again, I just thought, how can that be true? But really, when you think about it, there are people that maybe just didn't get the right education at school, maybe they're from disadvantaged backgrounds. But there's also lots of people who English isn't their first language. And if you're reading in English as a second language, reading is going to be much more difficult than it would be if it was in your first. You also have people who may be deaf and sign language is their first language. So English could actually be their second or their third. And when you actually look to other parts of the UK, you go to Scotland, that's 1 in 4 adults that have low literacy. And what does low literacy mean? It means that the people with low literacy can understand short, straightforward text when the topic is familiar. But if you introduce something that is unfamiliar sources, unfamiliar topics, and you have longer text, then that's going to cause problems. And if you think to like introducing dashboards immediately just sort of makes people uncomfortable in a lot of companies. You're introducing tech, they maybe haven't seen Power BI before, they aren't really used to data, so they're immediately uncomfortable. Imagine then they've also got low literacy, and low literacy is often associated with the inability to understand numbers as well. So there are some simple things you can do just to help people along. So don't use long and complex words. I work in consultancy, and when I first started, it just amazed me, like the corporate spiel. People love long and complex words, but when you use longer words, which are here 8 and 9 letters, users are more likely to then skip the short words that follow that. So they're immediately just missing some of the messages that you're trying to convey. You also want to avoid large walls of text. So if users have low literacy, they're going to find it quite tiring to read like lots of text. 2, use clear descriptive headings. Use short and straightforward sentences. So you want to aim for 15 to 20 words most. Left align your text. This was like a brainwave when I learned this one. I used to centre align everything because I thought it just looked cute. But I actually learned that left align text is the most accessible form of aligning text. And the reason being is it creates a consistent wall on the left-hand side that makes it easier as a pattern to follow. And also, if you consider that in English language, we read left to right, so you automatically go left to right without realising it. So a simple change I've made is I just left align everything now, headings and text. Obviously, sometimes it makes sense if it's like an image and you've just got tiny few words, you can put it in the centre, but generally left align text makes it much more accessible. You can test your readability score. So there are tools like Hemingway Editor. I'm not going to try and open this one, but you can enter in your text and it will give you a rating for how readable your text is. Much like if you're actually creating PowerPoint, PowerPoint will build that in now, so it'll tell you how readable it is. What I always struggle with is, okay, I know it's not readable, but how do I then make that better? Because it is a skill learning how to write in plain language. My new hack is Copilot. If you ask Copilot to put something in plain English for you, it does, and it's great. So I would definitely recommend it. And then also, it is important to find the words that your users are using. What I mean by this is, it's not just a case of using simple language, it's understanding sort of the slang. In some departments, they have certain words for things. They are comfortable with those words, and it's knowing those words to use. And then testing your content with your users. The amount of times, especially in my early years, I pushed out dashboards and they weren't used, and I just couldn't understand why. But it was often something so simple, like, I don't know what that metric means because they've never heard that word before, but it, made sense to me at the time. So just keep testing with your users, and much like Laz mentioned as well, provide user feedback options, because people might not immediately know that they have an issue until they start reading it, and then they're going to say they need a channel to give that feedback so you can go and update your text. And it's sort of, to me, just like all the hard work that goes into creating a report. You put loads of effort, you've modelled your data, you've built all your DAX. At the end of it, if someone didn't read it just because the words were too long, something so simple that you could have changed, it would be really disappointing. So plain language, I did touch on it then. What it means is, it's exactly that, just using plain, simple, everyday words rather than longer words. I've included a couple of examples, but there is a website called Plain Language Gov that lists a lot of the ones we use quite frequently. It is a hard habit to get into, don't get me wrong. I found us writing this report going, am I using plain language, and constantly checking. So some examples are, instead of using a number of, just use some. Instead of using consequently, which if you went to university, I loved using consequently, it's boost word count. Just say so. Instead of demonstrate, show. Due to the fact that, again, that is another one consultants love, just say due to, just say since. During the period, just say during. Impacted, we use that one all the time in dashboards. Affected, change. Maximum, minimum, that is literally constantly in dashboards. You can say greatest, you can say largest, you can say most, or least, smallest. Instead of numerous, use many, and instead of objective, use words like aim or goal. But again, you really need to understand your users, and again, not to keep leading up Laz, but much like Laz said, not the first people that tell you what the KPI is, the real end users who actually using the dashboard day in, day out. So moving on, designing for neurodiversity. So this one hit my radar recently because my husband recently joined an office job, having not worked in an office job, and that itself should be really funny, but he has ADHD, and recently he got access to a Power BI dashboard, and he was so excited, like, to come and show me his new dashboard that this company designed, and it was a really nice dashboard. I looked at it and I thought, wow, it was beautiful. They had all the things, they had the data dictionary, they had the landing page, they'd done everything right, but slowly he was just getting really frustrated with it. He couldn't find the information he needed, there was too many visuals on the page. He was getting really frustrated. Everything was abbreviated to the point where, like, there was words I didn't know, but there was also some that I guess to take for advantage, like financial year, but he didn't know what FY meant. He never worked in an office. In the end of it, he got so overwhelmed, he just rejected it. He just shut it down. It made him feel bad. And then afterwards, he asked me how to get Excel, the data into Excel, and so I showed him. But now he's not using this dashboard that someone obviously spent a long time to make. So, designing for neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the idea that people experience the world and interact with the world in many different ways. So, we're all neurodiverse. But neurodivergence is when someone thinks, communicates, and or learns differently from the predominant population. 1 in 7 people are estimated to be neurodivergent. And it's actually predicted that that figure is probably much higher, but historically tests haven't been there to support people. They're still not now. So conditions can include things like autism, attention deficit disorders, as you touched on, dyspraxia, dyslexia, Tourette's, but as well as other conditions. And it's really important to understand that, whilst I'm going to share with you guidance I found, no one experiences this in the same way. Everyone's experiences and needs are different, and that is why, again, you need to really understand your end users. There are definitely things that you can be aware of to make everyone more included. So, designing for users with dyslexia. Again, another stat, but 10% of the UK population have dyslexia. And that, again, is just people who've been diagnosed. So that is really quite a high number. That's 1 in 10 people. And again, it's probably much higher because historically there just weren't tests and support in place. So what don't you want to do for someone with dyslexia? Don't underline your words, use italics or write in capitals. I used to love using italics, but it's such a simple change that you can just make because I don't need to use them. Avoid serif fonts. So serif fonts have those little hooks on the end. And if you have dyslexia, that sort of makes the words just run together and then it causes crowding. If you need further emphasis on something, just use bold instead, because that is safe. Avoid abbreviations where possible. So I did just touch on this one, and this is honestly my pet peeve anyway. Especially as a consultant, you often join new companies, temporarily as their staff, and everyone talks in abbreviated forms, don't even use full sentences, and it's like no one has any idea what's going on. When you start to incorporate them in the dashboards, you're really just isolating your user base because you're assuming people know what they mean, but more often than not, they probably don't, but they don't really want to say they don't know what they mean. So use a heading font size 20% larger than normal text. As I said, if further emphasis is required, then use bold. Instead of using sans serif fonts, use sans serif, so things like Arial, they're just much easier to read. Use white space to remove clutter text. So good design general, just use white space. I often review work for my peers and they'll have spent ages designing, again, a really cool dashboard, it's got all the functionality, and they say, clients just rejected it, but I've done everything they've asked. And I look at it and it'll just be simple things like there just wasn't white space, things weren't aligned, there was heading missing. Use white space, but also make sure you use white space near text because that's going to remove clutter from near the text and it makes someone with dyslexia a little bit easier to read that text. Again, write in clear language, use everyday words. And when you are using abbreviations, always provide the expanded form on an abbreviation when first used. I would also extend that to say with dashboards and reports, if you've got multiple sheets, use it at least once on the sheet. Going back to the example of my husband who has ADHD, I said to him, "Where's there not a data dictionary that tells you what all these abbreviations mean?" And he said, "Yeah, there's a link to it." I was like, "That's cool." So I looked, but he said, the problem is he's got to go out the page, look at a different page, come back in, and now he's forgotten what they all mean again. So just put them on the page. It's so simple, but it's so effective. I did touch on sentence case as well when I said don't use uppercase. So instead of uppercase, the advice is generally use sentence case. Again, another mistake I often made was using title case. So what's the difference? Sentence case is when you just capitalise the first letter in a sentence. This is a high shape contrast. So if you look at the Lorem Ipsum example, this makes it much easier for someone to read. Whether that could be a slow reader, they've got dyslexia, or just anyone, it's just easy to read. The other thing with sentence case as well is if you've got brand names or something that does have a capital, it's easy to jump to that brand name, so it actually makes finding information easier. Title case is something that I used to use. I used to do my headings in the title case. I didn't think anything of it. Again, it's just a really simple swap out, but title case actually has too much shape contrast, so it is a little bit more difficult to read. If you look at the quick brown box, you can just sort of see it is not as clean as the sentence case. And uppercase, apart from feeling like you're just being screamed at, there's no shape contrast. So if you have dyslexia, that is really difficult to read. Moving on. Designing for users with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD. The issue that people have when they have ADHD is focus. So when you're doing dashboard design, you need people to focus on the important things on the page that you're trying to tell them. But often, as the example I use, people are getting overwhelmed. They're just going to shut it down. So don't put too much information in one place. You do see people trying to cram loads of visuals on one page, and sometimes clients will even ask for it, like they don't want the tiniest bit of white space, fill out with another visual. Also, when you start to consider accessibility, you need to make your font size bigger, you need more space. You actually need to spread your visuals out. avoid complex colored layouts. So if you have heavy cognitive load, such as with attention deficit disorder, clutter makes that worse. Even if you can sit around your house, if the house is untidy, you sort of just don't feel good, you feel a bit stressed. When you've tidied it, you like candle clean your sides, you're like, that is the same when it comes to dashboard design. You use to just feel calm and soothed. And avoid distracting elements. So this can be things like animations or playing videos. It's probably less common to use them in reports, but you know, sometimes you may have videos if they're embedded into apps as well. If you do need to have things like animations, videos, have a way to turn them off and don't have them playing straight away because they're just quite distracting. 2, use headings, subheadings, and bullet points to break up your text. Keep a consistent colour scheme and typography. So maintaining a sort of consistent visual environment by using like readable typography and fonts is going to help with reducing that cognitive load, and it supports the visual processing needs of someone with ADHD. It also means that navigating should experience is a little bit more intuitive and reassuring. So you just want to keep your navigation as simple as possible. You know, a lot of times there's a drop-down menu and then it slices here and then there's a filters tab. It is just overwhelming. Give clear reminders and prompts. So again, don't expect someone to remember something you've shown them on another page. Keep reminding them, keep giving them helpful advice. Often you know Power BI because you build the reports, you know where all the little buttons are and what everything does. But someone new to it, they just don't know where all that is. They don't know where the filters pane is. They don't know that there's a help icon, which I'll go into in a minute. But again, like I said, they don't know the drill downs are there. So just let them know, guide them through it, make them feel confident as they go along, and keep a clean, consistent layout. The help tooltip. If you don't actually know what this is, I've included a little screenshot where you find it because I don't see people using it too often. It is a little bit of a hidden thing and it's usually disabled on visuals, but you can just go and enable it. So within the visual settings in general, if you scroll down, where you have header icons, and this is like where you have all those alerts and all the other stuff going on, there's the help tooltip. As I said, it's disabled by default, but if you turn it on, you will then get this little pop-up with the, let's see, it's right at the top there, that will display to users, and you can choose what text goes in there. So it can be challenging when you have a dashboard, I appreciate, to put a lot of like content into the header and the subheader because it starts to look overwhelming. But you can just add it to the help tooltip. As long as you let users know that that help tooltip's there, they can then hover over that and get like a little bit of extra context that they might need. Or also helpfully, if you're working with sort of like a cross-department report, or maybe it's pulling in people from different branches who have different terminology, one trick is just put that different terminology in the help tooltip so everyone's sort of on the same page of what that KPI is. So, moving on, designing for users with autism. With autism, you want to avoid bright, contrasting colours. People with autism tend to experience sensitivity to sensory information, and one of those types of things is colours. So it can cause stress and anxiety and sensory overload. I personally don't like bright colours, hate patterns. I don't like going to Morrison's because the floor's patterned. I don't like going in the drain because the pattern's too loud. So I totally get this one. I know people do like to embed backgrounds and sometimes they can have like funky little patterns, but you know, tend to avoid it unless it's quite simple and soothing. If it's a little bit loud, it's just going to give someone cognitive overload. Avoid vague and unpredictable like link text. Don't make the user guess where they're going to go when they click a button because it might not bother you, but for someone with autism or anxiety, not knowing where that button takes them, it's a small thing, but it immediately is a little bit anxiety inducing. And avoid words and expressions that may have more than one meaning. So an example of this is engagement. This is often used at work to describe a work meeting, especially if they want to make it sound fancy. But if you have autism, you have a very literal understanding of language, so you might immediately think of marriage. Again, it's a simple swap, but it's just thinking about the words that you use on the page. Again, you also want to avoid using complex language, but also marketing jargon as well, because that just doesn't mean anything to you. So do use simple colours and single colour backgrounds, or if there's only a light pattern. Make sure though, if you are using a coloured background, that the contrast to the text is quite high, because you do often see people using them, they're a little bit too close, and that's what your accessibility checkers are for, so you can test that out. But you want to make sure that the text has a strong contrast to the background. Make buttons and link text descriptive. So yeah, just guide the users, let them know when they're gonna go. Don't just say this is the button, tell them where that button's gonna take them. Build simple and consistent layouts in appearance and behaviour. So this just relaxes someone with autism in knowing what to expect as they go, and it's going to build their confidence. But one recommendation I would have, especially with once you go away and you learn more about accessibility, really use live templates. I know Laz mentioned it, but when I first started in consultancy, I rejected templates for years. I don't really know why. I think I'm just excited at like the prospect of designing a new report every time with new colour themes, new layouts. But once you get something that works, you've tested it, you know it's accessible, template it and then just keep reusing it, because you know that someone can access that no matter what. Be as clear and specific as possible. So you can more with your text, make it very clear what your actual intention with the text is. And use image and icons. So again, I do keep touching on last, but he actually lined this one up perfectly for me when he did the little display of adding the icons to the KPIs. So one of the reasons to use icons is, it just directs someone to where they need to look on the page. People tend to look at images more than text anyway. So if you have icons on a page, their eyes are just drawn to it, can guide them to the information they need to see. But it also builds up association as well. So it can help someone associate an image, even if it's not the right image, to the text, which just again helps them have that comfortable experience. So, designing for low vision and use of screen readers. Now, Power BI does have built-in capabilities for screen readers. You do have to enter in alt text, and I would definitely challenge that many people haven't done this. What is a screen reader? So a screen reader is used if someone does not have any useful vision to be able to view content on a screen. In the UK, there's almost 2 million people with some form of sight loss. Not all sight loss means you're blind. In fact, people who are fully blind is actually a really small percentage, but low vision is when your eyesight cannot be corrected by glasses alone. And it is a really high number of people that struggle with it. And those people may not be able to use their mouse, so they might use a keyboard instead to navigate. It's something you've probably never really tested, whether your report can be used by a keyboard. And then when someone's using a screen reader as well, they'll still use the keyboard to navigate, but they'll get that information from the screen announced to them in clear speech. Within Power BI, I did touch on the fact that this is built in. So keyboard navigation, that is just built into Power BI. But you do need to set the tab order. So when a screen reader reads something out, it's not going to read it in necessarily the order you would see it on the page. Even when I did this PowerPoint, you would think it would just put the title at the top, then the text, but I had to go through and make sure that it was all in the right order. Within Power BI as well, you can configure your tab order. So you need to go through and set it up, make sure it's in the right place. But in addition to configuring the tab order, which is the order that someone with a keyboard would navigate through the screen, you want to disable anything that's just decorative. So if you've added some like a decorative logo, someone with a screen reader don't want to have to read that out. You can just set it to hidden and then it gets rid of it for them. It is screen reader compatible. There's 2 features that also work quite well with the keyboard navigation. Show data table. You're probably familiar with this anyway if you've built reports. This is already built into all your visualizations. Show data table is different for someone with tab navigation. So the one that they will see is slightly different. You can only access it by pressing keys to get there, but it does make that information readable in a data format. They can click through all the data points and get to the information they need. Focus mode as well. If you're low vision, but you can't see, focus mode makes it really big and it just helps someone navigate to it. But someone's not going to know that's there probably unless you told them. If they don't know that button makes it bigger, they've probably never pressed it before. And then lastly, high contrast color view. So this is built into Power BI, and if someone is using a high contrast on their computer, Power BI will detect it in desktop and switch automatically to a high contrast view. And then when the user publishes up the report, it will also publish that with them. But within service, there is a button as well, a toggle button that can make something high contrast. So again, it's something to make your users aware of because they might not be aware that it's there. I did touch on screen reader compatibility in alt text, but again, as I mentioned, you do want to configure your alt text. It's not there by default. So alt text is alternative text. It's a description that the screen reader is going to read out when someone sees it. With Power BI, you do have to write your own, but you can actually make them dynamic. You can add DAX in there as well. You can add conditional formatting, so you can convey the sort of key information to a user through adding that functionality as well. So, what are the do's and don'ts? The don'ts and do's. Don't use low colour contrast and small font size. Ugly and trying to fit loads of information on the page when I first started out. It's recommended to use a font size of actually 12 or above. So like I say, once you start actually making your font size 12, you need to spread your visuals out and use more pages. Don't spread content all over a page. What I mean by that is if you're using tabs to click through the content on the page, it needs to follow a flow that makes logical and linear sense to a user, or else it's just not going to have any context. Don't force mouse or screen use. So ensure that the report you build can actually be used by keyboard. Don't write uninformed links and headings, because if screen reader reads them out, it's not going to mean anything to them. So do use a font color with a high color contrast and readable font size. Build for keyboard use only. Place features in a logical order. That is just good design. You want your most important information at the top, and you want it to follow that logical storytelling order. But also consider it for someone who is accessing that with a screen reader. It needs to sort of flow. Provide alternative text for your visuals so they can read it aloud. You have to do it for text as well. It doesn't automatically add text, so you do need to copy and paste your text into the alt text box. Use headings when structuring visuals. This is going to help users skip directly to the parts that they want to read. Because imagine you have a screen reader and it's like if you ever wait for a voicemail message and they read out your whole number before you get to the bit you want to read. That is how someone with a screen reader is experiencing your whole report. There's probably a lot of content on there they're not interested in. But if you add descriptive headings, the way screen readers work is they work in an order, so it can read like headings first, for example, and someone can then just tab to that heading that they care about, but it needs to have the content there first for them to know. So, lastly, designing for mobility impairment. I actually did almost leave this out because I started to realise there was a lot of slides. But then again, I did research and I found out that mobility impairment is the most common type of disability in the UK. It accounts for almost half. And when you think about it, you can become impaired mobility-wise at any point in your life, whether that is through disease or illness, but you also could just fall and break your arm and now you can't use the world in the same way. So it's definitely something to consider with design. With mobility impairment, you don't want to demand precision. Picture that you're struggling to use a mouse. I have a tremor, so I generally sort of have shaky hands. That makes pressing a very small specific button a little bit tricky. Don't bunch interactions together. Again, if you're struggling a little bit with a mouse and the buttons are really close together, you might just press the wrong one and it's super frustrating. Don't make lots of dynamic content that requires a lot of mouse movement. There's a tendency in Power BI because it's fun to make dynamic content that we use everywhere. But if you actually start to consider how someone with a keyboard's got to navigate through that screen, or if they don't have the ability to use a mouse, they're going to miss information because it's in a tooltip. It just doesn't make it accessible. And that brings me on to don't use tooltips to convey important information. I do love the feature that you can put a visual in a tooltip. It's cool. But when you actually think about it, if you can't use a mouse, you can't hover on that image, and then you've just missed that information. If you do want to use it, by all means do, but make sure that you include it somewhere else in the report so that someone still has access to that same information. So you do want to make large clickable actions. Make sure your buttons and anything that someone needs to click to get somewhere have a good amount of space. Give interactive fields such as slices and buttons space between each other. I do see people like put slices so close together to fit loads on the screen, but again, just think about how tricky that is to actually navigate. And one thing that people have raised to me when doing user testing before with that is like, if someone's trying to access the header icons and you've put your images too close together, I don't know if you haven't noticed, but it starts to like cram it together and you can't actually see the information and it gives these little like annoying pop-ups. So you want to make sure again that you're utilising your white space. Make sure that all your content is accessible by keyboard only. So actually like test it, go and test through, see that if everything you build can be accessed by keyboard. Test your content across screen sizes and devices. This should just be across everything and everyone. I have seen quite a lot of examples of dashboards built when you have a really big screen. As developers, we tend to have like at least 1 or 2 massive screens. And then the person who's using it had just a tiny little laptop screen and it does not look the same. Or maybe they're using a mobile device. Everything starts to be bunched together. The text is really small. It's not readable. I just got into the habit now, drag it back across, drag it forth, make sure it is readable. But again, during user testing, ask people what screens they're using and ask them, is it accessible on their screen size? Do add tooltips as charts as ancillary information. So you can add data to tooltips, and that then is accessible in the show data for each visual. So it's just about using your tooltips smartly. I'll wait for time. Good. Okay. So in summary, Power BI provides the capability for you to build accessible reports, but as the report author, it is down to you to include that in your designs. When we build these accessible designs, we'll all benefit because we all benefit from good design. Even if you don't fall into the category of having impairment, everyone likes beautiful design, everyone likes accessible design. It will, I promise you, make your reports look better by the end of it. Now, I have provided this checklist, and I do appreciate that the text is super small, and that's quite ironic considering I said make the font text big. But honestly, the PowerPoint visuals are so hard to use. I thought I'll make it into a fun visual, but I was just getting stressed out. But I will share these slides afterwards if anyone does want this, and it just runs through each section. So with your visuals, ensure you've got colour contrast between the title, the axes label, which is the one I used to try and hide, and the data label, and the guidance is 4.5 to 1. Avoid using colour as the only means of conveying information. So again, use labels, use markers, use icons. Ensure that alt text is added to all non-decorative visuals on the page. So if it is decorative, hide it, but if it's non-decorative, add that alt text in and make sure it is actually a meaningful bit of information. Check that your report page works for colour vision deficiency. As I said, there's a number of tools that you can do this, but honestly, just start by getting yourself a colour palette that is, to begin with, colourblind friendly. Don't use tooltips to convey important information, just add them as ancillary information. Make sure that information, if you do, is accessible somewhere on the page. Enable the help tooltip. If you didn't know it was there before, you're welcome. It's one of my favourite things I discovered last year. Slices and actions. Keep the style consistent across pages. Make sure that that navigation journey just makes someone feel comfortable. They know what to expect. If you build multiple reports, make sure you're using a template and that style is consistent across all your reports that you push out. Because then next time you introduce a new report, someone just has that comfortable feeling with it. They know what to expect. Make large clickable actions and give your buttons space. Try navigating your report with a keyboard to ensure that it is acceptable for keyboard-only users. Make the buttons and links descriptive. As I said, it's just anxiety for people when they don't know what's going to happen when they click a button. Build simple, consistent, and logical layouts. Again, that is just good practice, good design, but it also makes people feel better when they view it. Use single colour background and simple colour themes. I do sometimes hear things that like, when it's more forward, I want more colour, but it doesn't really add any value and it actually just takes away from all the important information that you're trying to convey on the page. One thing I didn't mention earlier as well is that although you want contrast, white itself can be quite jarring to a lot of users, especially people who are neurodivergent. So try to use sort of like softer colours, like very light greys and creams against darker text or vice versa. Lost where I was. Text in different size screens. Honestly, people just don't do it, but it just amazes me because it really does not look the same in a laptop as it does on your big screen. Utilise your white space. Set your tab order and hide decorative items. And with text, quite a lot to take away here, but use a font color with a high contrast and a readable font size. I have had feedback before where it's just like the font was too small and I thought, what do you mean? It's like size 11, but really try for 12, if not 14, and make sure your headings are that 20% bigger than what font size you're using. With that as well, use consistent text or use about 3 different types of font on the page. Just stick to 1 or 2. Write in plain language. If you need help, tools like Copilot are great now for doing that. And check that the text that you have created actually is readable to all types of users. Use simple sentences and utilise bullet points when it adds value. Align your text to the left. That's probably the quickest change you can go on when it makes any dashboards, as well as use sentence case. Consider providing a glossary for terms for terms that readers do not know. Give clear user guides, reminders, and prompt, and avoid unnecessary technical language at all costs, because I think this is probably the death of all dashboards. But that goes for documentation too. Don't make it so hard for someone to get through that document that it never gets read and it gains dust. So there's, on top of what I've shared with you today, there's more accessibility guidance. I definitely encourage you to go out there and do your own research. As I mentioned, there's the Web Accessibility Content Guidelines. Microsoft have their own guidance called Microsoft Inclusive Design. The Home Office also have design and accessible services to create some fun posters as well. And then thank you for listening. I appreciate it's a lot of slides. It's late now. I appreciate your attention. My name's Sarah King. If you want to add me on LinkedIn, it's Sarah Breastbury, just to keep it confusing. Have a good evening. And if you have any questions, that would be fun. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned the high contrast option in Power BI. I've seen it before. How well does that work if your colours aren't already accepted?
It works anyway. Sorry. So with the built-in feature of high contrast for Power BI, it doesn't take into account your colour scheme. It's just like a default setting. If you've seen it, it's like black and yellow. It just applies. It doesn't regard your colour scheme, basically. It's just going to apply over the top of that.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, I will do.
Doesn't go well with images though, does it?
The high contrast design, I haven't tested it, does it not? Looks off. Like, again, but like you have to consider use of images really. I mean, I do support the use of icons to convey information, but I wouldn't really support the use of adding complex images in the first place because they're just distracting. Okay, it's in the settings. Okay, yeah, where you set the tab order. If I had Power BI open, I'd show you. But in the top bar, there is, I think it's visibility setting, but I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's within your very top window pane, might be the design one. There's an option to set the tab. But Power BI do also have all of their accessibility guidance online as well. There's a page that you can use, and it shows you exactly where all the settings are and how to set it up as well.
It feels like most people would be able to follow the guidelines. But also maybe, and you also need to be comfortable, as last said, pushing back and saying, I need more time to incorporate it. But also, it feels like it'd be useful to have, because you can make the design mobile friendly for mobile phones. It'd be useful to have like a diversity friendly tab so that you can not to cheat.
What do you yeah. So you're saying that it is easy to incorporate all of these things, but obviously naturally it takes a bit of time. Sometimes you get pushed back, especially having things like alt text, the client's demanding it needs to be done, it is going to take you a bit of extra time. First thing, that's why I've been using a template, it's good. It can't get you past everything, but if you've already templated it with some examples of visualizations and fun, you've already like half the way there. Yes, it would be great if they just created a diversity tab and it's just loads of buttons to flick through. But unfortunately, it isn't that simple as well, because even though these are guidance, some of the guidance clashes because everyone experiences it in different ways. So that is why you do need to know your end users as well. There isn't like a one size fits all, unfortunately, although there is a lot that would help.
So that could be AI, if you give it the right prompts.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I definitely see with the way they're embedding Copilot into things, that could definitely be something that would be cool if you went, Copilot make this dyslexic friendly and it is magic. But considering how much we can't even get users away from Excel, I think probably a bit away from that. Any other questions? Yeah, I'll come over to you because I'm not going to hear.
You mentioned about slicers.
Yeah.
Slicers. Sometimes a user demand like 8 to 10 slicers. How to manage, particularly drop-down slicers, because we can make the text the heading bigger, but the drop-down values they are small in for me. How to manage these?
Yeah, definitely is a compromise. So the question is, what if the client asks for like 8 or 10 slices and then they want the full little burger menu that gives the drop down? Because unfortunately people like go and Google it and then they do ask you for it. It is a challenge. Generally, I am quite strong with clients when they ask for more than about 4 slices. Now I'll just say no and I'll explain the reasons why. You can use the filters pane, and I think part of it's an education piece for people, like teaching them that they can't just get the same information from the filters pane. Maybe you can use other ways of navigating, but yeah, generally it is difficult because the moment you start making the slicer heading bigger, it doesn't quite fit on the page. But my argument with people is really like slices take up important retail space on your page to begin with. So if they really don't necessarily need to be there and you can put them in the filters pane, reduce the number that are actually on the page.
It is not visible.
I think, yeah, they have to, when you publish the filter pane open though, that default publishes it with the filter pane open in service. If you publish it with it collapsed, it obviously doesn't. But again, you should be giving guidance to users that the filter pane's there to begin with, because a lot of UAT fails because users didn't understand the data was filtered in the first place. So again, it's that educating piece that the filter pane is there. This is what it does. This is what it can be used for. But I do agree. I know slices is one of those that you do sort of have to battle with people. But again, you know, if you explain to people why that's not accessible, it's a pretty good argument to begin with. Any other questions?
Planning dashboard and go to and you want to make your dashboard accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
So how all of these that you mentioned be taken into consideration in this design?
Yeah, so the question there is, with neurodiversity, there's a lot of different do's and don'ts, and some of them slightly contradict themselves. There is a lot to take in, and how do you know who you're designing for, and which ones do you take into consideration? It's a tricky one because even if you know your end users, one, they might not feel comfortable sharing with you that they're neurodivergent. Two, they may not know or they may not identify that way because they just might not have been diagnosed. If you do know anyone who has been diagnosed, you'll know how long it takes. So you do have to go into it just designing it to begin with to be accessible, considering those things. Although there is a lot of guidance, when you actually look through it, most of the guidance benefits everyone. You know, we use the example of not using like loud, garish backgrounds and patterns. That does sort of benefit everyone. And, you know, although that specifically I mentioned under the autism tab that people don't like busy backgrounds on things, someone with dyslexia would be distracted by that background when they're trying to read text. Someone with ADHD is going to be distracted by that background when they're trying to focus on what they need to focus. So when you actually put all of them together, it benefits everyone. Any other questions?
Typically see the accessibility testing on Power BI dashboard. So I work with clients where we have created services, the live services department and create. So if we have our service has to go through the accessibility WCAG assessment, and only then the service has to go by.
Yeah.
But I never work because that is going to be very wide audience. Power BI dashboards or Tableau dashboards have never gone through any accessibility testing because simply it is going to a certain setup. If your session will really
Yeah, I agree. So it's just shared there that, you know, working in apps, working in web, it does have to go through accessibility guidance and be approved. But with Power BI dashboards, Tableau dashboards, we've never really considered that kind of guidance and because it's going to a smaller audience. I do just think when you learn the statistics about it though, you realise that even in a small audience, you probably have multiple users who have these needs. So that for me was the most eye-opening thing. This is not like a minority. You know, it is almost a majority. It is people that you work with. It might be you. So it's definitely things that we need to start to consider.
there might be some then follow-up questions when you are doing the basically business, when you are discussing with the business, might have to include these set of questions as well, right? That what is the audience look like?
Yeah.
Have any diverse accessibility requirements on?
See, I have asked that question to people before, and they'll often say, "No, we don't have anyone that needs that." Even in massive companies, and you think, but do you know that? You know, because like just no, it's that people might themselves not know. They might not feel comfortable telling you, so you don't know that. And if you don't include it now, what when someone new joins the company? You don't have to redesign everything and make them feel really uncomfortable. It's just something that you have to consider from day one. But yes, although you do need to ask your audience, you also have to expect that they just won't necessarily know. You almost have to tell them that yes, it does need to be designed this way. Yeah. Yeah.
Working in education, and I have some people working with this disability section. And they decided some kind of like a switch on and off taps using a tool called this with that. And it has all the color palette for all these impairments that you mentioned just today. And it's basically or if you have disability, please click on this. If you don't have it, keep it as it is.
Okay, so you say this bit that you can see your reports and it gives you buttons that you can then like change the colours.
Yeah.
Does it also do things like change the font size, is it? Or is it like
Yeah.
what did you say it's called?
It's called this.
Okay, Biz
With Z.
with a Z.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
like
cool.
a visual.
Yeah. Nice. Any other questions, or is everyone diving pizza at this point?
Fingers crossed the pizza's outside.
Right, well, I will let you all go. Well, thank you. And if you have any other questions, I'm just listening.